Hey everyone, you're listening to Talk Recovery Radio, and we're going live on Facebook. We've got Noah here as our guest. It's personal story time, and we are going to start the show off.
And welcome back to Talk Recovery. You're listening to Vancouver's Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. That was a little Pearl Jam for you, and we got Canadian Steve Broccoli coming on next. First up, though, well, second up, actually, is our personal story today with Noah. Noah's in studio with us. Let's pass it over to Francis.
Hello. So today we're talking recovery with Noah about his personal story of overcoming addiction in his life. So welcome to Talk Recovery, Noah.
Thanks for having me.
When did you start using drugs, Noah? Tell me more.
About 12 or 13 years old, I remember starting to experiment with drugs. And I think that I've heard a lot of people say that they started using drugs because of some sort of negative emotions they had. And for me, it was just like I wanted to fit in and I wanted to use drugs and I liked using drugs. And so, from a young age, that's what it was.
So you started at 12 or 13 years old?
Yeah, I'd say 13 just to be safe.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, we don't want to embellish. So what drugs did you start with at 13?
So it was primarily weed and alcohol were like the first two things. Alcohol first, and then there was smoking pot with my friends came pretty short after that. Yeah.
Okay. And then what did that escalate into?
Well, eventually, so there was about, I would say, a safe 8 month to about a year period of strictly just like pot and alcohol. And then as soon as I started going to high school, and that was when I started being introduced to things like MDMA, ecstasy, eventually cocaine. And that was kind of the second tier of drugs that I was using. And then eventually, as I moved high schools and started hanging out with older guys who were using harder drugs, it became everything from heroin, crystal meth, crack, all of it.
Wow.
So,
as a mom of like a 15-year-old, I couldn't imagine. What were your parents going through?
Well, you see, it wasn't funny at the time, and it wasn't for me and it wasn't for them, that they're actually in recovery. Both my parents are clean for decades, a couple decades. So at that time, I would say they were kind of a bit of a buzzkill. That was the idea for me. It was that, that they're ruining my using. They always know when I'm high. It's not fair. And for them, it must have been terrible to see their son. I'm an only child, so their only son go down the same path that they had both gone down and came out of.
And so they had been in for 25 years. So did you go to meetings and were you familiar with 12-step recovery, that sort of thing?
I wouldn't say familiar. To me, it was a bit of a mystery. I didn't really know what it was about. I didn't really understand it. It kind of seemed like a cult. They chanted things. It was strange.
What did they chant?
Well, not chant, sorry. They kind of just, that they do. They kind of like, yeah. They do the preambles and they all kind of say things in conjunction. So that was kind of...
So it seemed really super odd to you as a kid.
It seemed odd to me, yeah.
And did it seem like something you would want to be a part of?
Definitely not.
Drug use?
Definitely not. It was definitely low down on the list of things I want to be a part of. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
so then,
sure.
pardon me. So then, what brings you into recovery?
Running out of options that's the short answer is running out of options. Like, it was not my first option, and it was something like, I always say this is something that my parents did, right? This is not something that I wanted to do. It's like, okay, that's great, that works for you. I'm glad that you guys have what you have, but it just ain't gonna work for me.
Right.
And that was without even trying it, that was my perspective on it, right?
Right.
So.
And so when's the first time that you tried it? Where were you at with your drug use? Was it like...
Well, I would say it was mostly a financial problem and a housing problem. Those were the main things. Not an addiction problem. That was, clearly there was, but I mean, in my mind, it was a housing problem. And
how was it a housing problem?
So I had been kicked out of my house. I had been couch surfing, going from house to house, like friends' parents' houses, and having to explain that to them and make up things. And then there was...
one of the ways that your parents were trying to help you get off drugs was by no longer giving you a place to live and money to have.
It wasn't... I didn't have a place to use and feel safe and comfortable, and they kind of took the comfort out of my addiction pretty quick.
That's a tough one for parents to do.
Definitely.
They
Probably.
must have been really scared.
Yeah. And so what happened, later in getting into treatment my first time and getting into recovery my first time, there was, so I ran out of money. I ran out of places to stay. I remember going through my entire phone with about 100 contacts, and calling all of them and nobody's picking up the phone, right? And that was not a good feeling. I remember that distinctly, that feeling of like, oh crap, like this is bad in terms of I'm all alone and I didn't want to sleep in the street. I didn't want to, it was coming to an end, or so I thought, right? And so I reached out to a drug and alcohol counselor and he got me into a treatment program, and then from there I went into a 12-step meeting, and I remember introducing myself as an addict, and yeah, that was my first experience.
What was that like for you? That's at 17?
Yeah, that was at 17, yeah. So I had just turned 17, and I had
Did you feel that? Like, did you feel like I'm an addict? Like, did you have a realization of what that meant?
You know what? Like, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I was very conflicted in my life at that point, and like I really, like, I think deep down I knew I was an addict, but I was in a lot of denial. I wanted to think like, okay, so I can stop using the harder drugs, I can stop using the heroin, the crystal meth and the crack and all that, and I can start just going back to what it was like before, because I liked what it was like before. That's what I started using drugs, because I liked the effects, right? And I liked the social aspect, I liked the fact that I had friends that I could relate with, and I wanted to go back to that, right? And I didn't want to accept the fact that for most people there's no going back. So
okay, and before Giuseppe takes over here, I just want to ask you, so you're from Toronto, and so you tried to get clean in Toronto, and then you ended up coming to New West. Was there a big difference what was the difference for you between Toronto and trying to be a part of that recovery community and in New Westminster?
You know what? It's a great community in Toronto. I have no bad words to say about them, but I believe that there was a lot of my parents' friends around the room, and that was kind of weird for me. There was a lot of like, I don't think I was ready was another thing. And the third thing is that, I didn't have any dope dealers in BC. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know where to go. Well, I soon learned, but I mean, I it's pretty easy to find. But
I figured it out.
But the reality was that it was a new start, and that was like the big thing, right?
But let's go back a few days here.
Oh God.
And like many younger people, deciding to get well is a big decision, and it took you a little while to actually make that decision, and you had a lot of people involved, and you were in a harm reduction program, and you were on medications and so forth. What was it like for you, so some of our listeners that are listening that think that they need to hold on to that harm reduction model? What did you go through? What was those days like back? I think that was 2 years ago during the Christmas season.
Yeah, so I think that it's safe to say that harm reduction was a gateway for me into recovery, but it was not an answer, right? So I remember feeling stuck. Like, that was the main thing, was feeling stuck and feeling scared and not having the same numbing sensation that dope had, but still being physically dependent on something. And yeah, those days were really scary. There was a lot of fear and a lot of not knowing what was gonna happen, right?
So you were on Suboxone?
I was on the Suboxone, yeah, for about a year on and off with, yeah, I didn't take it as prescribed.
Were you using drugs when you were on Suboxone, or were you?
Yeah, so there was stints of me where, definitely using drugs, yeah. And so I would take the Suboxone for a short period of time. I'd use everything else that, other than the opiates, which actually like kind of, it blocks the high, right? So believe me, I tried. It didn't work that well, so I used other things, and then I would go off the Suboxone for a couple months, go on a huge bender for a couple months, basically come to, get back on the Suboxone, go for a couple weeks, and this whole time I'm trying to taper down. There was no part of me that wanted to stay on this, because even in my using before, I had never wanted to be on harm reduction. I will never take methadone, I will never take Suboxone. I would rather be a junkie than have my dope dealer be a doctor in a lab coat, and that was my opinion, right? And so at this whole time I was trying to taper off it and get off it, and it didn't work for me.
So the health authorities here are convinced that Suboxone is the answer to the overdose crisis, and every opiate addict needs to stay on Suboxone long term, like 5 years, 10 years. There's no like this Suboxone should be like taking Flintstones in the morning, like just take it. And what do you say about that?
Well, I say that it's putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, right? Like, if we're just giving someone who's addicted to drugs more drugs, first of all, of course they're going to say yes, because that's what I did. Well, they're like, oh, I think you should be on this because it'll stop you from using drugs. Well, my you know, I do think that it has its place for sure. I think that it's important to have available for me for short periods of time, you know, to have people, like, it can be, like, I'll say it, that it did save my life, right?
Okay.
There's many times where instead of going and using drugs and using opiates, like using large quantities of opiates intravenously, so there's obviously a huge risk associated with that, and I'm taking a pill instead of where there is no risk of overdose. So yes, it did save me, but it never like got to any of the underlying causes of why I used in the first place, right?
So here's the glitch with the system. So here you're in Toronto. CAMH is really big in Toronto, and you know, lots of Suboxone, lots of methadone in Toronto. Some of the most amounts of methadone and Suboxone in the country are prescribed there, in the millions of dollars. You know, so you were plucked out of that and brought into an opportunity to do some recovery and get substance free from medications and from so there's a doctor out there that says you're going to die, Noah, you need to go back on Suboxone.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel?
You know what, I know that it's not true, right? And I know that this has worked for me, like being abstinent has worked for me, and I just don't believe it, right? And I think it's sad when it happens, because I remember using, obviously, like, every time when you go to the methadone clinic, they take your urine, they screen you. Okay, you've been using opiates this week. Okay, so you're not following your Suboxone, and they tell you, you know what? Oh, you've been using. You need more. That's the problem. You need more. We'll put you, instead of 8 milligrams, we'll give you 14, right?
Yeah.
And that's your answer, right? So yeah, that makes me sad that people are being told that, because
did you ever get pushed to do recovery in that world of?
Never. I was never given a counselor. I was never given any additional support. It was go in, pee in the cup, here's your prescription, go downstairs, put the pill under your tongue, and then go home. Right?
See, and that's what I don't think harm reductionists understand. They really think that we live in a utopian world where let's just give addicts Suboxone, let's just give them methadone, and that will lead them into recovery. You're like, you know, person number 1022 that I've asked that question to, and they've all said the same thing. No, it was never, you know, in our local health authorities, it's actually pretty much illegal to suggest somebody go into recovery when you're prescribing Suboxone and so forth, because you're going to kill them, and that's what's going on in Vancouver.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you're sharing your story, because there's some truth to that. Like, how old are you now?
21.
And how long have you been clean from?
Almost 2.5 years.
When's the last time you took Suboxone?
About 2.5 years ago. Yeah.
There you go.
It was the last narcotic drug that I
And
ever
are
took.
you any different? Are you less of an opiate addict than the guy that's using on the streets right now?
No.
Are you like less of a junkie?
Junkie to the core.
Yeah,
Junkie to the core.
Do you like heroin? Eh?
I love it. Yeah.
Good for you. You know, and
That's
so
the
I'm
problem.
perplexed. You know, here we go. And so tell us. So there's a mom out there that's probably scared because she's got all these different ideas and concepts and theories, and you know, there's so much evidence-based theories out there that I can make, you know, Tim Hortons donuts look like a science-based treatment program for opiate addiction. I mean, it's just how much money you throw at it, right?
Yeah.
So what do you tell, like your mom's in recovery, so you had a bonus there, which is one of the reasons why you probably got to where you're at. You knew the right people. What do you say to a mom out there who's scared? Her young kid's using opiates, and the doctor's saying this, and you know, TV says this, and there's AA meetings and NA meetings. You know, what do you say to them?
Well, you know, for me, I think that Suboxone could be a short-term thing for someone. So it's hard to get clean if you're dead, right? Like it's pretty hard, you know. So the idea is that for me, this is no medical standpoint, but this is just my opinion. Is
Your
that
personal story is worth a lot.
Yeah. So I think that it is a short-term answer, right? It is short-term that you can get some relief, you can get a bit of a clearer head, there's no risk of overdose, and there's that, right? And I think that can be a stepping stone into recovery, right? And I think that, you know, it's hard because the resources, like there's a lot more resources leaning towards harm reduction than there is towards recovery, right? So I think that, like, it's hard to find resources that will support that. But I think that the most important thing is finding someone that supports that, right? Is like you can have some. So for me, I was put on the Suboxone. I stayed on the Suboxone, but then I was kind of guided towards additional supports, right? Like there was an interventionist that she didn't work as an interventionist in my life, but Patty, she helped, and she gave me some information and asked me about my drug use and gave me some support. So I think that the important thing is that, because we can't stop people from using, right? If someone wants to use drugs, they're going to use drugs. And it doesn't matter if they're going to lose their limbs, if they're an addict, they're going to use, right? And I think that the important thing is to just provide those, here's your options. You can go to treatment, you can go to detox, you can do these things. And if you want it, here it's on the table, right? Here's someone that you can call this number if you need someone, because I had that number. There was a drug counselor in Toronto, and I had that number, and I had it in my phone, and I actually memorized it for some reason, right? All these years of using, I had it memorized. And I called him when I needed help, and I said, I'm done. And he said, all right, come for lunch, and we can talk, right? So I had that resource when I needed it, even though that year on harm reduction, right?
So we got a few minutes left. So you withdraw from your opiates, and then you're put on Suboxone, and then there's a withdrawal from Suboxone. So let's talk about that. So, because a lot of people get hung up on the actual withdrawal of the medications. Some physicians will not taper people. Some physicians put you on more of a dose. What was it like for you to actually come off of Suboxone?
You know what? It wasn't a pleasant experience. I'm not going to lie and say it was a pleasant experience, that's for sure. But it was manageable. And I think that now the way that they're doing it, that I've seen it at least, like professionally, is that they've kind of found a way to make them as comfortable as possible. And it, it's crappy. You got yourself into a position where you're chemically dependent on drugs. Like, there's no easy way out of that, right? But I think that they've actually found a way that's where the path of least resistance, right? And I know for me that it was like I was given the Suboxone and nothing else, and then tapered down to nothing. And they tapered me pretty slowly. It was pretty humane, right? Like, it wasn't like I think that the worst part about it was that when the drugs were out of my system, there was no buffer between me and my real feelings, right? And that was the hardest part. Was like the withdrawal symptoms, like I had been through detoxes, I had been through all that stuff, but I think that really the worst part about it was me, right? Having to deal with me.
All right, perfect that you talked about that, because that's how we want to wrap up the show. So the buffer between your feelings, your life today. So what's going on for you right now in recovery? What's your life like?
My life, I don't know, this is the part where that's like hardest for me to talk about. It's easy for me to talk about the bad stuff, but the good stuff is like, I don't know, it's overwhelming to speak about. It's like, for me, like I work in the field of addiction. I get to help people. I get to youth specifically, right, which is what I wanted to do. Even while I was on drugs, I wanted to do that, which is kind of messed up, and I'm glad no one let me do that. But I think that it's like I have a good role in my job, which I've never had. I never really had like a job that I held down. I worked at a grocery store that I'd steal bacon from, right, and that was like the extent of my employment history, right. And I think that so I'm employed. Like I've had lasting relationships since I've got clean with people, which is a huge thing, right? I'm not cycling through friends every couple of weeks, which I.
So you got friends.
I got friends.
You got a community.
I got my family. I get to go visit my family. I'm actually going to Japan with my dad in October. We're gonna go visit a friend who helped pioneer a recovery program like Narcotics Anonymous out there. So I'm gonna go check that out there, which is pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff going on. I'm in the process of slowly completing my high school and eventually trying to go to university. So
that's a long ways away from where you were, 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, stuck on Suboxone, not able to even sign up for high school. So.
And you had to go to a pharmacy every day.
Yeah.
Wow. So that is an amazing story. We really appreciate it, Noah. And
thanks.
Congratulations on 2.5 years clean. You're listening to Talk Recovery on Facebook Live, and we are going to wrap up our show today. Thank you very much. And we're also going to wrap up our Facebook Live. Thank you for joining us on Facebook Live, and we're going to get